Morning came slowly to the town of Millbrook, Ohio, a quiet suburb pressed between cornfields and a fading highway exit. Mailboxes leaned slightly from decades of snowplows and careless teenagers. Small houses sat close together like tired neighbors sharing secrets. At number 214 lived a man named Carl. Carl worked nights repairing commercial refrigerators across the county. He liked routine and strong coffee. Every evening, he returned home shortly after 3 in the morning. Neighbors rarely saw him except on garbage day. But that Tuesday, something unusual appeared at his kitchen window. From the outside, the glass looked fogged with pale shapes. Not stains exactly. More like delicate white flowers pressed against the walls. They spread across the paint in branching patterns, thin stems of white powder reaching toward the ceiling corners. The shapes looked almost beautiful in the morning sunlight. Yet something about them felt wrong. They hadn't been there the night before. Mrs. Grant next door noticed them first while walking her dog. She paused and squinted through the glass. Carl was lying on the kitchen floor. Face down beside the refrigerator he repaired 2 nights earlier. The police arrived 20 minutes later with flashing lights. Officer Ben pushed open the door carefully. The air inside smelled damp and strangely dusty. Carl's body was cold already, but the walls drew everyone's attention. White crystalline flowers covered nearly half the kitchen. They spread from the lower wall like frost-climbing glass. Ben touched one with a gloved finger. The crystal collapsed into chalky powder. He frowned and rubbed the grains together slowly. They felt dry despite the humid smell inside the room. Nobody understood why the walls were blooming overnight. Detective Laura arrived before the medical examiner finished his notes. She stepped carefully around the powders scattered across the floor. The kitchen lights made the crystals glow faintly against pale paint. They looked almost alive in the warm bulbs. Laura leaned closer and traced one branching pattern slowly. Each crystal cluster looked like tiny white petals. Petals made from brittle mineral dust. The coroner spoke quietly behind her. Carl probably died sometime before dawn. Heart failure was the early guess. Carl had no obvious wounds. But Laura noticed something strange near the baseboard. The crystal growth began low on the wall, almost exactly along one horizontal line. Above that line, the wall remained mostly clean. Below it, the white flowers exploded outward. A young officer whispered about toxic mold. Another suggested chemical contamination from refrigeration gases. Someone mentioned strange fungal outbreaks in wet buildings. The word mold spread quickly through the small kitchen. By afternoon, the county health office arrived wearing masks. They collected samples of the white crust carefully. Carl's house was sealed with yellow warning tape. Neighbors watched from sidewalks with uneasy curiosity. The laboratory report came back the next morning. The crystals contained gypsum and simple mineral salts. Nothing poisonous, nothing biological, just mineral deposits normally found inside drywall. But the growth rate seemed impossible. These crystals covered half a kitchen overnight. A building inspector shook his head slowly. Maybe the walls were soaked with contaminated water. Maybe hidden mold triggered mineral reactions. The explanation sounded technical enough for everyone involved. Carl's death was ruled natural causes. Heart failure during the night. The strange wall crystals were labeled environmental damage. The house remained condemned for possible toxic contamination. Millbrook police closed the case quietly 3 days later. Most people forgot Carl's house within a week, except one person who read the report carefully. Dr. Evan worked at a small materials laboratory in Columbus. His job involved investigating strange failures inside buildings. Concrete cracking too quickly, paint peeling without obvious moisture, bridges shedding salt crystals during winter storms. Evan liked problems that behaved like puzzles. Every structure told a physical story through chemistry and stress. His desk overflowed with samples sealed in plastic bags, dust from basements, flakes from brick walls, white crust scraped from parking garages. Minerals fascinated him because they moved slowly yet relentlessly. Water carried invisible ions through every porous surface. When moisture evaporated, those ions formed crystals. That quiet process was called efflorescence. Most homeowners recognized it as chalky stains on basement walls. But the Millbrook report caught Evan's attention immediately. He read the description twice without blinking. Crystal flowers appearing overnight inside painted drywall, large enough to cover half a kitchen wall. That detail bothered him deeply. Efflorescence usually took weeks or months to grow visible deposits. Even damp basements required repeated evaporation cycles. The Millbrook case suggested something far faster. Too fast for ordinary building chemistry. Evan called the county office requesting the laboratory samples. The clerk sounded relieved someone actually cared. 2 small bags arrived by courier the following afternoon. Inside lay fragile white fragments collected from Carl's kitchen wall. Evan placed one under a microscope immediately. The crystals showed thin needle shapes typical of gypsum growth. That meant calcium sulfate had formed inside the drywall pores. Gypsum could grow quickly under the right conditions, but overnight growth still seemed ridiculous. Evan leaned back in his chair thinking quietly. Either the report exaggerated the timing badly, or someone helped those crystals bloom exactly on schedule. Morning light spilled across Evan's cluttered laboratory in Columbus, a small building behind an aging concrete testing facility. Most people imagine scientists studying exotic particles or distant planets. Evan studied walls, bricks, mortar, paint layers, drywall fibers, and the strange minerals hiding inside them. His mornings always began the same careful way. Coffee first, then microscopes. He labeled every sample with date, location, humidity, and temperature. Buildings spoke through patterns if someone listened patiently. A chalky crust could reveal months of moisture movement. A cracked tile could expose years of thermal expansion. Evan trusted slow evidence more than quick conclusions. That philosophy shaped his entire career. He rarely visited crime scenes or police investigations, but structural mysteries occasionally crossed his desk. Insurance companies often called when walls behaved strangely. That morning, he tested mineral residue from a flooded basement. The white dust formed harmless sodium sulfate crystals. They grew after winter road, salt seeped through foundation cracks. Evan photographed each crystal cluster under magnification. Needles, plates, and tiny branching forms appeared clearly. Each mineral grew with its own recognizable geometry. Chemistry left fingerprints as distinct as human ones. He finished the basement report shortly before noon. Then he opened the Millbrook evidence bag again. The fragile fragments glittered under the microscope lens. Gypsum needles radiated outward like frost on cold glass. Beautiful structures for something so ordinary. Yet their size troubled him deeply. They suggested extremely rapid crystal growth. Water must have carried dissolved minerals through drywall pores. Then, evaporation triggered explosive crystallization near the paint surface. Evan leaned closer, studying the edges of the sample carefully. The outer crystals looked young and brittle, almost fresh, as if the wall had bloomed just hours earlier. Evan called the Millbrook Health Office again that afternoon. The clerk transferred him to Detective Laura without hesitation. She remembered the strange kitchen immediately. Laura sounded tired but curious about Evan's questions. He asked about humidity readings inside Carl's house. She checked the report slowly. The kitchen measured ordinary indoor humidity that morning, nothing extreme. He asked about plumbing leaks or burst pipes. Laura paused while scanning inspection notes. No visible plumbing damage appeared anywhere in the house. The drywall looked dry when inspectors arrived. That detail bothered Evan more than anything else. Rapid crystal growth needed moisture moving through porous material. Without water, the minerals stayed trapped quietly inside the wall. Evan explained efflorescence in simple language. Invisible mineral salts traveled through wet drywall like passengers in water. When evaporation occurred, the salts formed solid crystals. That process normally happened slowly, days, weeks, sometimes months. Laura listened quietly on the phone. Then she asked the question he expected. Could those crystals grow overnight somehow? Evan hesitated before answering carefully. Yes, under extreme conditions it might be possible, but the wall would need massive moisture inside it, almost like a sponge filled with mineral solution. Laura sighed softly on the other end. The official report declared environmental contamination and natural death. Reopening the case would cause paperwork and unwanted attention. Ignoring the chemistry felt worse. Evan stared again at the brittle crystal needles. Science hated loose ends. So did he. He finally spoke with quiet certainty. If those walls bloomed overnight, something forced them to. Laura agreed to let him inspect the house personally. Millbrook was only 2 hours away. Evan packed his field microscope and moisture probes immediately. Carl's house still sat behind faded yellow tape when Evan arrived. Millbrook looked even quieter in the afternoon sun. Laura met him outside beside a dusty patrol car. She unlocked the door while explaining the original timeline. Carl returned home around 3 in the morning. Neighbors saw nothing unusual during the night. Mrs. Grant discovered the body around 8 o'clock. The kitchen smelled faintly stale when they entered again. The walls still carried ghostly white crystal patterns. Some clusters had fallen onto the floor already. Evan knelt beside the baseboard with a flashlight. The growth clearly started along a thin horizontal band, exactly 15 inches above the floor. He measured it twice to be sure. Laura watched silently as he unpacked instruments. First, he tested humidity near the wall surface. Normal indoor levels appeared on the digital screen. Then he inserted a thin moisture probe into the drywall. The reading surprised him immediately. The internal moisture remained unusually high, not soaking wet but far above typical indoor drywall. That meant water once filled the wall cavity recently. Evan traced the crystal lines slowly along the kitchen perimeter. The band followed the wall perfectly straight, almost like a bathtub ring left after draining water. He frowned and stepped back thoughtfully. Water rarely rose evenly inside a vertical wall. Leaks usually spread downward in chaotic streaks. But this moisture line looked precise. Too precise. Evan tapped the drywall lightly with his knuckles. The hollow sound suggested empty space behind it. Standard wall cavity between wooden studs. He checked plumbing diagrams Laura obtained earlier. No pipes ran through that section of the kitchen, yet the wall had clearly held water recently. Evan stared again at the sharp mineral bloom line. One question suddenly overshadowed everything else. How did water fill a sealed wall cavity so evenly overnight? Laura walked Evan through the rest of the house slowly. Carl's living room looked ordinary and slightly cluttered. A television hummed softly beside an aging leather chair. Nothing suggested panic or violent struggle. Evan checked several interior walls with his moisture probe. Most readings showed perfectly normal drywall conditions. Dry, stable, and chemically boring. Only the kitchen wall showed abnormal mineral activity. They moved toward the narrow hallway bathroom next. Evan scanned the sink pipes and water heater connections carefully. Still nothing unusual appeared in those fixtures. Then Laura opened a small utility closet near the back door. Inside sat a compact electric pump on the floor. A flexible hose coiled loosely beside it. The equipment looked recently used but not installed permanently. Evan crouched and examined the pump housing closely. The plastic casing still smelled faintly of damp concrete. Laura checked her notes again with a puzzled expression. Carl didn't own a basement or crawl space requiring drainage pumps. The house sat on a simple concrete slab foundation. Pumps usually appeared only during flooding repairs. Evan ran a finger along the hose opening. A thin ring of white powder clung inside the rubber. He scraped some into a sample vial quietly. The powder looked identical to the kitchen crystals, gypsum residue mixed with mineral salts. Laura frowned while watching him seal the vial. But the pump wasn't connected to any wall. No holes appeared in the drywall nearby. No tubing entered the structure anywhere. Evan nodded slowly without answering. The pump suggested water had moved somewhere deliberately, but it didn't explain the straight moisture line inside the wall. Two strange facts now floated separately in his mind. A flooded wall cavity with perfect water height, and a portable pump dusted with the same crystals. They stepped outside to breathe cooler afternoon air. Millbrook's quiet street buzzed with distant lawnmowers. Laura leaned against the patrol car, thinking aloud. Maybe Carl tried draining something before he collapsed. Perhaps he pumped water from a leak somewhere overnight. Evan remained silent, staring at the kitchen window. The ghostly white blooms still covered the interior wall. A delivery truck rumbled slowly down the street nearby. It stopped at the neighbor's driveway across the road. A young plumber climbed out carrying a coil of tubing. He waved casually toward Laura while unlocking his van. Laura waved back and asked about his service call. The plumber laughed and pointed toward Mrs. Grant's house. Frozen pipes burst last week under her kitchen sink. He mentioned filling wall cavities to pressure test repairs. Sometimes plumbers pumped water behind drywall deliberately. It helped reveal hidden leaks inside wall pipes. Evan turned suddenly toward him with sharp interest. Did the water stay trapped inside the wall cavity? The plumber shrugged casually while unloading his tools. Only if the cavity was sealed tightly enough. Studs and insulation sometimes formed temporary water chambers. Evan felt a quiet click in his mind. A sealed wall cavity could hold water briefly, especially if someone pumped water inside intentionally. Then, evaporation might push dissolved minerals toward the paint surface. Laura watched his expression change instantly. He stared again at the kitchen window patterns. The blooming crystals suddenly looked less mysterious, more like a timer. Back in his Columbus laboratory, Evan prepared a simple experiment. He built a miniature wall section from scrap drywall and wooden studs. A hollow cavity formed naturally between the panels. He drilled a small hole near the baseboard height. Then he mixed water with dissolved calcium sulfate powder, essentially liquid gypsum solution. The mixture resembled mineral-rich groundwater found in many buildings. Evan pumped the solution into the cavity slowly. The drywall absorbed moisture like a thirsty sponge. Soon, the interior space filled nearly halfway with liquid. He sealed the hole carefully with tape and plaster. Then he turned on a warm air fan nearby. Evaporation began pulling water through the porous drywall fibers. Mineral ions traveled invisibly with that moving moisture. Hours passed quietly inside the lab. Evan checked the wall surface every 30 minutes. At first, nothing appeared on the paint layer. Then tiny white specks emerged near the internal water line. They looked like dust grains under the light. Another hour passed. The specks grew into fragile crystalline clusters. Needle-shaped gypsum crystals spread outward rapidly. They followed the exact height where water once rested. By evening, the test wall showed clear blooming patterns. White mineral flowers crawled across the surface. Evan leaned closer with the microscope camera. The crystals matched Carl's kitchen samples almost perfectly. Growth had happened within only 6 hours. He turned off the fan slowly. One variable changed the entire reaction speed. Evaporation rate. Fast-drying forced minerals outward in sudden crystallization bursts. Evan sat back quietly, absorbing the implication. Someone could flood a wall cavity deliberately, then allow evaporation to bloom crystals overnight. Not supernatural growth, just chemistry running on a schedule. Laura returned to Evan's laboratory 2 days later. She expected charts, maybe complicated chemical reports. Instead, Evan pointed toward the small experimental wall section. White crystals already covered part of its painted surface. Laura stared silently for several seconds. The pattern looked disturbingly familiar, almost identical to Carl's kitchen wall. Evan switched on a small desk fan nearby. Air flowed gently across the drywall surface. Evaporation accelerated instantly. More crystals appeared within minutes, like pale frost. Laura stepped closer, watching the surface change. The process looked almost alive under the lamp. Evan spoke calmly while the wall slowly bloomed. Drywall behaves like a sponge made from mineral powder. Inside it exist microscopic pores filled with trapped air. When water enters those pores, minerals dissolve easily. Calcium, sulfate, sodium, and many other ions travel with moisture. This mineral soup moves through the wall quietly, but evaporation pulls the water outward toward the paint layer. As water disappears, the dissolved minerals crystallize suddenly. That process forms efflorescence. Usually the crystals appear slowly in damp basements. But speed changes everything when evaporation increases dramatically. Fast drying concentrates minerals along one invisible line, exactly where water once rested inside the cavity. Laura nodded slowly while watching new crystals emerge. So the wall remembers the water level. Exactly, Evan replied softly. That memory becomes a white mineral scar. He showed her the pump hose sample under magnification. The powder matched gypsum crystals from Carl's kitchen, meaning someone pumped mineral-rich water deliberately into that wall. Laura crossed her arms thoughtfully beside the experiment. But why flood a wall just to grow crystals? Evan turned off the fan and faced her quietly. Because overnight blooming looks unnatural to most people. It resembles mold outbreaks or chemical contamination, something frightening enough to explain sudden illness or death. Laura spread the Millbrook case files across Evan's work table. The timeline looked simple at first glance. Carl returned home shortly after 3 in the morning. His neighbor heard the kitchen refrigerator running normally then. No shouting, no struggle. Carl likely collapsed near the appliance minutes later. Heart failure matched the coroner's early report, but the wall crystals appeared only hours afterward. That detail changed everything. Evan traced the moisture line height on his experimental wall, 15 inches exactly. The same measurement recorded in Carl's kitchen. That height suggested deliberate filling rather than accidental leakage. Someone pumped water into the wall cavity intentionally. The portable pump inside the closet supported that idea. Laura flipped through Carl's financial records quietly. He recently repaired refrigeration systems for several local businesses. One client stood out immediately: Millbrook Medical Storage. They stored vaccines and temperature-sensitive medications. Carl had serviced their cooling units twice last month. Laura leaned back slowly in her chair. Refrigeration technicians handled antifreeze solutions and chemical coolants often. Some of those fluids contained mineral stabilizers. Evan nodded while examining the pump residue again. The gypsum crystals suggested calcium contamination in the liquid, possibly from industrial coolant mixtures. Laura continued reading Carl's service notes carefully. One entry mentioned a dispute about faulty temperature alarms. Carl believed the alarms were intentionally disabled. That could spoil stored medicines without immediate detection. A quiet fraud worth thousands of dollars. Carl wrote one final sentence in the margin. Someone at the facility was hiding something serious. Laura closed the notebook slowly. Carl may have confronted the wrong person. Laura drove back to Millbrook the following morning. The refrigeration facility sat beside an aging warehouse district. Inside, she met the building manager named Derek. Derek greeted her politely, but looked uneasy quickly. Laura asked routine questions about Carl's recent service visits. Derek confirmed the technician inspected their cooling units twice. Both visits happened late at night. Less disruption for stored medical shipments. Laura walked slowly through the refrigerated storage hall. Cold air hummed through ceiling ducts continuously. Temperature monitors blinked along each wall panel. Everything looked perfectly maintained now. Too perfect. Laura asked Derek about alarm failures Carl reported earlier. Derek dismissed the issue with a tight smile. Minor calibration problems? Nothing serious. Yet financial records told a different story. Several vaccine shipments spoiled quietly during those weeks. Insurance claims covered the losses almost immediately. Laura stepped closer to the refrigeration control console. A service port sat behind a removable panel, exactly the kind technicians used during maintenance visits. She imagined Carl discovering disabled alarms during inspection. Maybe he threatened to report the fraud. Derek watched her carefully from across the room. Laura suddenly pictured the pump inside Carl's closet. Portable, simple, easy to transport inside a tool bag. A refrigeration technician would own equipment like that. Carl certainly did. But Derek once worked maintenance before becoming manager. Laura remembered reading that detail in employment records, meaning Derek understood both pumps and wall cavities. He also understood mineral contamination inside coolant systems. Laura looked back at Derek quietly. Someone flooded Carl's kitchen wall intentionally, then waited for crystals to bloom overnight. A haunting explanation for a sudden death. Derek's calm expression faltered for just 1 second. Laura returned to Columbus that evening with several sealed evidence bags. Inside were coolant samples from the refrigeration facility. Evan analyzed them under laboratory lights immediately. The chemical profile matched something unexpected. High calcium content mixed with sulfate stabilizers. Exactly the combination required for rapid gypsum crystal growth. Laura watched the spectrum lines appear on Evan's monitor. The coolant looked harmless at first glance, but those additives served a specific industrial purpose. They prevented corrosion inside metal refrigeration pipes. If someone diluted that coolant with water, minerals remained abundant, enough to feed explosive efflorescence inside porous drywall. Laura leaned against the lab counter, quietly thinking. Carl probably discovered the alarm tampering during maintenance work. If vaccines spoiled, insurance companies would pay quickly. Thousands of dollars could disappear quietly through false claims. But Carl wrote notes about the malfunctioning alarms. He planned to report the problem soon. That would ruin the entire fraud operation instantly. Laura opened Carl's service notebook again, slowly. Several shipment numbers appeared beside his final entry. Evans searched those numbers through federal medical logistics databases. The results froze the room for a moment. Those shipments weren't ordinary vaccines. They included temperature-sensitive cancer medications, very expensive ones. Insurance coverage for a single spoiled shipment exceeded $200,000. Laura felt the scale of the scheme expanding rapidly. If alarms were disabled deliberately, shipments would overheat quietly. Spoilage could appear accidental during routine inspections. Insurance payments would follow within weeks. Carl's discovery threatened a fraud worth millions annually. Suddenly, his mysterious death looked less natural. Someone had strong reason to silence him permanently. 2 days later, Laura returned to the Millbrook facility again. This time, Evan accompanied her, carrying a sealed evidence case. Derek greeted them politely inside the refrigeration control room. His smile looked thinner than before. Laura placed Carl's service notebook on the metal console. The pages lay open beneath the fluorescent lights. Evan unpacked a small microscope beside it. He placed a vial of white powder under the lens. Crystals filled the screen attached to the microscope camera. Gypsum needles, identical to the kitchen wall samples. Evan spoke calmly without raising his voice. This powder came from the pump found inside Carl's house. He placed another vial under the lens immediately. Coolant residue from the facility maintenance tanks. The crystals looked indistinguishable on the monitor. Laura continued the explanation slowly. Carl discovered disabled temperature alarms during his inspection. He likely confronted someone about the fraudulent insurance claims. Later that night, his kitchen wall cavity filled with coolant solution, pumped deliberately to a measured height. Evaporation did the rest quietly overnight. White crystals bloomed across the wall like contamination. A perfect distraction explaining sudden illness inside the house. Laura stepped closer toward Derek now. You worked maintenance here before becoming facility manager. You understand pumps, pipes, and refrigeration chemicals perfectly. Derek remained silent, staring at the monitor screen. No confession came, but his hands trembled slightly beside the console. Millbrook returned to quiet routine within a few weeks. Carl's house eventually lost its yellow warning tape. Investigators removed sections of the kitchen wall carefully. Behind the drywall, they found a small drilled access hole, hidden neatly behind a removable cabinet panel, exactly where a hose could reach the wall cavity. Court proceedings continued slowly after Derek's arrest. Fraud charges appeared first, then evidence of tampering with a death investigation. But the strangest evidence remained purely scientific. Mineral crystals growing like ghostly flowers overnight. Most neighbors still remembered that eerie kitchen wall. Many believed something supernatural happened inside the house. Yet the explanation required no ghosts at all. Just drywall chemistry and evaporating moisture. Water moved silently through microscopic pores inside the wall. Mineral ions traveled with that invisible flow. When evaporation accelerated, crystals formed suddenly along the waterline, a blooming pattern written entirely by physics. Evan later repeated the experiment for investigators again. The crystals appeared exactly the same every time. Predictable, precise. Science rarely cares about appearances or superstition. It simply follows physical rules quietly. Laura visited Carl's empty house one final afternoon. Sunlight still touched the faint marks on the repainted wall. No crystals remained now, just smooth paint covering the evidence. She stood there thinking about how convincing the illusion looked. So here is the final question. If you walked into that kitchen first, what would you believe?